Hello everyone, welcome to Debeaujeu Part 3. You got the Bub031 here again. And this time, after laying the cork bed, we're going to be putting down track now. I'll be showing you the tools and all that. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy. We actually sanded down all the cork bed. And we leveled out this module just to make sure that there are going to be no ski jumps or anything like that, because you don't want a car to derail or anything like that. So what I did was with the help of Mr. Bob Moore, we sanded the tops, giving it a nice smooth feel. Same with all the ends and the joints, because that's where you don't want the ski jumps. All right, so to laying track, we're going to go over the tools here next. So here's what we're going to be using. It's a little bit bunched up right now. We have our track, we have a level, we have our switches behind the toolbox here. We also have our no nails, which is for the cork row bed and the track. I'm using Pico 100. We have our caulking gun. As well, we have our soldering iron, which I will show you right here. As well as we have our flex and solder. We have also X-Acto knives, files, and we have our track saw, which I will show you here in a quick second. There it is. Okay. It's a lot of tools that we're going to be using. Let's move on to the plan. So this is what the Debeaujeu is going to look like. We have our switch points, our 2 or 3. As well, we're going to be cutting it down the middle. And here we go. So let's start. Okay, so now we're going to start this. So in that little white jar, I have my joiners. In these little clear plastic totes, I also have T-pins for once we glue down the track. So we're going to start actually connecting the track with each other by soldering. And we're going to be gluing it down with the no nails to the cork road bed. So here we go. So the first thing we're going to make sure is that the joints on the switches and each piece of track, they're tightly flushed. You want to make sure that none of your solder goes in there, or else it's going to cause derails and all that. So we heat up the soldering iron to the right temperature. We're going to put a little bit of flex onto the soldering iron and solder just to make sure it's good to go. And as well, we're going to put some flex on the track. It doesn't matter how much flex you put on, it's not going to affect it. You'll be able to clean that off after. You just got to be careful with the solder though, due to the fact that you only want to solder to the outsides. You don't want to solder the inside of the joiners, or else that's going to cause derailments, because you got all that, you may get a blob and all that. So as you can see, I'm applying flex right now. Now we're going to grab our solder and our iron, and we're going to go to the outside of the track. So all I'm doing is I'm just putting a little bit on the tip, and then I'm just heating up the rail. Once that's done, I just apply the solder to the other side of the rail, and it just seeps in nicely. As you can see there, it's a little bit hard to see because Mr. Bob has his hand blocking, but you'll be able to see after on one of the switches that we're going to do. So I'm going to be moving back and forth here. There's a lot of back and forthing going across the modules when it comes to soldering. It's just easier to see that way. So I'm going to add a little bit more solder. Then I'm going to add it to the track, and I'm going to start doing the outside. I'm going to hold it there, let it seep through, and we're done. Come back around, and so on and so on. A little bit more flex, because nothing can go wrong with flux. And we'll add a little bit more to the switch. And always make sure once you're done, clean off the tip, or else you'll get buildup and then you'll get bad contacts. So So now we're going to do this last portion right here. And you always want to keep nice tight pressure on this as well. And we're good. It's in there nice and good. Now, we're going to move on to actually gluing it to the road bed. So, before gluing it to the road bed, what we're doing right now is we're actually cutting a notch in for where the switch is going to go. So with that, it's so that once we glue it down, it's free and the switch is not going to be interfered by the block and all that by when we glue. So I'm just filing it down a little more, making sure there's room, because I may want to also add a switch piece portion to it, either a switch machine or a hand throw. This is why we're also outside. It's a little messy. All right, so now we're going to move on to gluing the track to the road bed. Okay, so now we are now at the main line. The first thing we're going to do, which is the hardest part, is the crossovers. So, as you can see, I've already put the crossover together, and that portion is already soldered. What I'm doing right now is I'm actually filing down the ends of where we cut the rails so that it's a nice smooth fitting with the joiners, or else you're not going to have a good fit. And as well, Mr. Bob, he sort of shows me another few techniques here. Might I suggest you guys go watch his channels there of how to actually build modules? He is an amazing person that actually helped me with this. Okay, so we got that done. I'm now putting the joiners together. I'm going to make sure they fit nicely into the crossover, nice and tight. Like I said, remember, you want to make sure you keep it flush. You don't want no gaps. The next thing I'm going to do is I am grabbing some more flux, because now this piece is ready to go on. As well, I'm making sure from the end, because there's joiner tracks that got to go, it's 6 inches from the end. So, I was having a little bit of issue there with a tie. So here's another thing. You file down the ties once because it's good, because the tie is going to go into that little gap. So I'm right now cleaning down a tie, and then I'm going to move on to actually doing the soldering here. So as you can see, I got my solder. I put a little bit on, and I'm just going to apply it. Right there. I'm going to apply a little bit of it, and now I'm going to grab the other stuff here, and I'm just going to attack it to the track. So like I said, you go to the outside. Clean off the iron, and now, as you can see, we placed it in. So as you can see, I've made quite a bit of progress now. I'm now just finishing up I did one track so far, and this is how it's going to look like for the rest of the main line. Clean that off. Just adding more solder to that one. And then that's going to continue on down. Clean it off just a little bit as well, so that's what the file's for. And we also have track erasers as well, just to keep it clean. And that is the main crossover and the approach crossover done. We're now going to move on to the spur that would go to, say, another possibly module in the future, but we'll talk about that later. So I'm spreading more down, more no nails, and now we're going to move on to placing that track piece. So this is my curve, and as you can see, you'll also be seeing the process of the T-pins going down. So pushing it flush right up against the switch. And we're going to start iron off this piece and solder it. Well, just before we had to clean it off right there. So you want to make sure, like I said, keep the solder clean. So, working on the outsides here. And clean off. Work it a little bit more. Clean up the iron. And now we're going to start forming it and pinning it to the cork road bed so that it dries. If you guys look at the first siding over on the far end, it's actually dried up pretty quick because of course it's another day and it's no longer got pins into it because it's now being held in place pretty good. So I'm now putting the pins in and forming the track off to the areas just to show that it's going to be possible. It's the interchange track that I'm working on. So keep putting in my T-pins. Getting that nice curve down. And once that's done, after that I work on the sidings and the other tracks. And then we'll move on to the far end on the most important piece, which will be a switch that we're going to have to do at the far end. So, that's it. We're now going to move on to the main switch portion that we're working on. Okay, so we're now at the other end of the module. Now this switch, what we're doing as well is we're adding the joiner sleeves that are going to be staying with the modules. That way there you slide them out so that the 6-inch piece of track could, the joiner track could actually fit in there. So these pieces will stay with the switch. So we're just making sure that they're 6 inches from the end. And then what we're going to do with this is we're going to heat up the rail with the joiner inside. We got some joiner pushers made so that they could fit right on in, as you can see here. So we're going to push them right in. It's a little bit of work there. And now we're going to heat up the joiner tracks so that it melts the plastic a bit, so that we could actually are able to push the joiner right on in. So it's temporarily pinned for now, the switch. We will get to that portion after. But basically the process of laying track and using the no nails, it's the same throughout with this. I'm just right now explaining here that how do you make the joiner portions to the module. Taking a little, it takes a little bit of time here. So we're now gonna place heat on the rail. You don't flux or anything for this. You just put heat onto the rail once you put the joiner in place. It is a little bit of a hassle, but here we go. Still not clean enough. And we're good. So now we're going to place the heat, like I said. Here we go. So this is actually making a space for that joiner to slide in nice and loose. So some joiner tracks with this position, like I said, take your time. You will be going through a lot of joiners quite a bit if you don't take your time and just breaking them. Okay, so we're now doing the other rail. Pushing down nice and hard. And that's that. So we're now going to start placing our track. So this is now the main line is going to be connected. And as well, the switches will be connected after. Of course, I'll talk to you about that later. It's just, this is the process. We are now going to move on to the epoxy. So the next thing that we're doing here is we're actually going to be putting epoxy in this jointed area, because later we're going to have to cut this out after. So what we're doing right now is we're just putting epoxy on each end, and then we're putting ballast on top. That way there, it's going to hide that, and it's going to make it look very nice and very detailed, and it's going to look like it just matches. Okay, so we have the outer edges now done. As you can see, the ballast is now set on all this area. The next thing we're going to do is get a different style epoxy to go in the center of each joiner before we actually have to do cutting, and then we'll have to do some over on the ends as well to make sure that everything is good to go. So we used a 5-minute epoxy on the outside just to give you more details about it, and now we're working with a 15-minute setting epoxy in the inner rails. So it just flows a little bit better, it gets into all the grooves, it will hold the track down a little bit better. Now I'm just going to take the rest of this ballast, and I'm just going to tap in just a little bit here and there into the center grooves before we do some cutting after. then you just tap it in just a bit. If you get a little bit of epoxy on the rails, don't worry. All you have to do is just clean it off later with an eraser or some sandpaper. A little bit more here on the edge. And as you can see right now, the epoxy is already settling in with the ballast. So it's good to just hold it down before we start cutting. Okay, so another thing is you want to put a lot of ballast down as well, because it's just going to also seep in. So it's all going to go bone away later, so it's going to look very clean right after. So when you're putting ballast down, especially with the epoxy, you can put a lot on it there, that way it holds it into position. Okay, we're going to move on to the next step. So that's it for this segment, guys. The track is laid. We're next going to move on to scenery. So thanks for watching, and as always, make sure the signal's green to keep moving down the line.